Hi, everyone. We are now on the second part of the central nervous system lecture, and we're going to talk about the diencephalon, the hindbrain, and the brainstem. Okay, so let's talk about the diencephalon first. What is that? Okay, so the diencephalon is going to include three regions, all of them found in the middle, the center of the brain. The thalamus is going to be right here. Okay, so the thalamus is going to be located near the third ventricle. So it's really round, so I think it looks like an eye, especially with this piece right here. Okay, so look for the eye, that's the thalamus. And below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. As we already have seen, hypo means below, so that's this part right here. So to me, if the thalamus is the eye, this is the nose. That's just how I think of it. And then posterior to that, this region right here with this little bump right there, that would be the epithalamus, Okay, so all collectively, the region for those three is the diencephalon. Okay, so for the thalamus, the function of the thalamus is to direct sensory information to the correct place within the cerebral cortex. Okay, so please remember the cerebral cortex, that is the region that perceives the sensory information. You're aware of it, you understand it, you connect it, you feel it. That's the cerebral cortex, but you have to get the information to the correct region within the cerebral cortex, and that is the function of the thalamus. Okay, so it acts as a sort of relay station in order to direct the information to the correct place. Okay, so for example, visual information has to be directed to the visual cortex in order for you to perceive that visual information. Okay, so the thalamus, it just tells it where to go. Right, so if you had damage to the thalamus, you could have damage to the sense, because even though the thalamus doesn't perceive that information, if it's not able to be directed to the correct location, you're not going to be able to perceive that sensation. Okay, so it's a support system again for the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is very important to staying alive because it maintains homeostasis. And in physio, we're going to talk about that a lot. Homeostasis is just maintaining an internal environment. And so it does that by regulating the autonomic nervous system, includes the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. It helps to regulate that. It also does it by hormonal regulation as well. Okay, so if we look at here's the thalamus. Here is the hypothalamus below it. Coming off of the hypothalamus, there's this little stalk called the infundibulum. Coming off of that, though, that is the pituitary. And pituitary is a gland. It's sometimes referred to as the master gland of the body because it secretes hormones that regulate other hormones, other tissues in our body. So if the pituitary is the master gland, the hypothalamus is the king because the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. Also, the hypothalamus produces hormones that then go to the posterior pituitary and then acts as a storage and then are secreted from the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the hypothalamus has a lot to do with maintaining your internal environment, okay, homeostasis, keeping you alive, basically. And then the last one is the epithalamus. The epithalamus, again, that's the posterior one here. And the big thing about the epithalamus is that it includes the pineal gland. Okay, so this little nubbin coming off of the back of the epithalamus, that is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is important because it produces a hormone called melatonin, which some of you are probably familiar with. Okay, so melatonin, that is that hormone that's involved in regulating your sleep cycle, putting you to sleep, basically. So here's what happens. During the day, when you are getting light into your brain, that light goes to the pineal gland and inhibits it, prevents it from producing melatonin. But when it starts getting dark at night, okay, the lack of the light stops the inhibition, and stopping an inhibition is the same as stimulating. Okay, so when the light goes away, it starts getting dark. That's when the pineal gland starts producing that melatonin, and the melatonin is going to start putting you to sleep, getting you sleepy. Okay, so the epithalamus, that contains that pineal gland there. Okay, that brings us to the hindbrain, which includes the cerebellum. Here is the cerebellum. So remember that this area here that's all wrinkly like that, that is the cerebrum. This is the cerebellum with the two L's in there. And to me, it looks a little bit like a ball of spaghetti. Like if you took a ball like a spaghetti and just sort of balled it up, that is the cerebellum. And running down the middle, connecting the two hemispheres of the cerebellum is called the vermis. Okay, so it has two hemispheres right down the middle. That is the vermis that connects the two hemispheres. And then inside of the cerebellum, so if you took the cerebellum and cut it through a sagittal section, you would have something that looks a lot like a tree. That's called the arbor vitae, which translates to tree of life. And what you should see on here is you have the white matter inside and then the gray matter making what the leaves of the tree. So for a lab, you'll need to be able to find that. The arbor vitae, please remember, is an internal structure, so it only would be seen inside of the cerebellum. Let's talk a little bit about the function of the cerebellum. So remember that the cerebral cortex, the primary motor cortex, that's what initiates a voluntary movement. So it says, oh, arm move, and then the arm will move. But to coordinate and sort of smooth out those movements, that is the job of the cerebellum. So for the cerebellum, what it does is it takes information in from your equilibrium in your inner ear and information from the tendons in your muscles, and it takes that information in, smooths and coordinates it all together, and then that allows you to make a very nice, easy, coordinated movements. Right? So your cerebrum, your cerebral cortex, that's what makes you move in the first place. But the cerebellum allows you to be more graceful as you're moving. So what would happen, what kind of symptoms would you expect if the cerebellum started to go away, right? So this is seen in Spinocerebellar Ataxia. Ataxia means like degeneration of it. And if you have degeneration of it, see how it kind of falling apart? If you're losing the cerebellum, do you think you would have paralysis? So paralysis means you can't move at all. And the answer was no, you would not have paralysis, because remember the cerebral cortex is what causes the movement, but you would have things like tremors, so you would have uncoordinated movements, right? So you do things like overreaching and underreaching. So say you're trying to grab some water, you couldn't quite get it properly. And that's because the cerebellum is in charge of coordinating the motor response to move with the sensory input to make sure that it's a smooth, coordinated action. So you would still be able to move, so you're not paralyzed, but you wouldn't be able to do any kind of movement that requires a lot of coordination, such as things like walking. That requires quite a lot of coordination, and you would have very jerky overall movements. Okay, on to the brainstem. So there is the cerebellum, so cerebrum, cerebellum. This area right here, sort of anterior to the cerebellum, this is collectively called the brainstem. There are three regions. You have the midbrain, which is this area here, sort of like a no man's land between the thalamus. And then underneath it, what I call the first bump, the first bump is the pons. And then underneath that, what I often call the second bump, that is the medulla oblongata. For humans, the pons is bigger than the medulla oblongata, but it's opposite in shape. Okay, so here we have the pons, big first bump, second bump, medulla oblongata. So let's look at some of the functions for that brainstem. Running along the middle of the brainstem is what we call the reticular formation. And the reticular formation is an area where you have white matter tracts bringing information towards the cerebral cortex, right? So you're going to take that sensory information and you're going to relay it through. Okay, so if the information coming up from the spinal cord will go through the reticular formation on its way to the thalamus, and then the thalamus will relay it to the correct spot. As it's going through the reticular formation is going to do the very first initial analysis of it, and it's going to filter out less important information. So information, for example, if you have constant stimuli, it'll sort of get rid of all the background white noise, and that'll help make it so that once the information reaches the cerebral cortex, only the pertinent, most important information gets there. Okay, so it's going to filter it out. And another thing that it does is it regulates sleep and alertness. And so if you have damage to the reticular formation, that would definitely cause a coma, because you wouldn't have the conscious alertness, because the information is not going through. It has to be filtered through the reticular formation first. Also there is where you have what are the vital reflexes, and what vital reflexes means are those are the things that you're not really thinking about that are sort of keeping you alive. For example, respiratory rates. So at the bottom of your thoracic cavity, you have your diaphragm, and your diaphragm is going to contract and relax to cause, breathing, ventilation. And so in this area here, so here's the pons, there's medulla oblongata. In this area here, that's where you're going to find the vital reflexes that set the rate of the respiration, and that's going to depend upon oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. So it sort of senses the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, and it'll set the rate accordingly. So if you had damage to this region, to this brainstem, it could mean sudden death, because maybe I don't know about sudden, quick death, because you wouldn't have those vital reflexes that you need to survive. Okay, so again, I just wanted to point out that even though the cerebrum gets all the gets all the glory, it's the one that's for conscious thought. These kinds of the brainstem, these sort of, and the hypothalamus, these sort of places that look like hardly anything, they're very important for keeping you alive. Okay, let's do a quick review. So what I want you to do is go ahead and press pause, and I would like you to try and answer A through G. Then we'll come back and we'll do it together. Okay, so A is the cerebrum, B is the corpus callosum, C is the thalamus, D is the hypothalamus, E is the pons, G is the medulla oblongata.